Good morning, everyone. This is Perry Scholes. I am the founder and chairperson for CPG Professional Networks. Thank you very much for joining us for our webinar this morning, Cybersecurity. Yes, you are at risk. Our presenter is Ted Banks, an attorney from Scharf's Bank and Marmor LLC, and he's going to take us through the presentation. We have the chat function available that you can send us questions that we'll answer at the end, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to type them in, and we'll get to them on the back end. So with that, without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Ted Banks. Ted, thanks for being here today with us, and away we go. Cybersecurity.
Thank you, Perry, and thanks to those who are joining us for this. As many of you know, my CPG pedigree is 32 years in the law department at Kraft Foods. Since that time, I have been in private practice in a law firm in Chicago, and we like to say that we are small but mighty, and someone figured out coincidentally that fits with the initials of the firm, so we thought that was very fitting. But my partners are litigators. I do corporate counseling work, essentially what I did when I was in-house at Kraft, dealing with subjects that would concern CPG companies, and always try to deliver them in a practical way as opposed to a overly legalistic way, which is why a lot of lawyers get a bad rap. But today I want to talk about cybersecurity, something that many of us have heard about, and hopefully give you some suggestions about how to deal with the issues. So let me start out thinking about this. The first thing to say is everyone should assume that they are a target. Even if you're an individual or a small firm, it doesn't mean that you will escape, because the bad guys that do this do it just by trolling the internet for openings in security. They're not necessarily looking for specific targets, although sometimes they are, but generally they have automated bots that just try every IP address they can. If they find one they get into it. So you have to think about this both in terms of your personal computer and your business computer, or the computer of the business you might work for, or a client you might be doing business for. A lot of big companies are targeted because they have money to pay ransom, and we'll talk about ransomware in a bit, and they have rich data that they can repurpose. And a lot of times when these bad guys go after companies, they have two things they use to effectuate their coercion. Number one, we will make it very difficult for you to continue to do business because we're holding your computers hostage. You can't use them and you can't get to the data. And number two, we will threaten to release all sorts of bad data that's in there, or embarrassing data. And you may remember a few years ago, the North Koreans got mad at something that Sony Pictures did and started releasing all sorts of embarrassing comments that some of their executives had about others in the industry, and it was ugly. But if you're in a small firm or an individual, think of yourself as most vulnerable, because you are, as they would say, easy pickings. You may not have the security that will take any effort at all to get through, and they can just go in and grab you. And in fact, they would be happy to get a modest ransom from you. It doesn't have to be huge. Just do a few $1,000s, and you're back in business. But it doesn't mean that it won't be a very difficult time for you to deal with. And whatever business you're in, you have to think of yourself as having a professional obligation to use the appropriate technology to maintain the confidentiality of the data you have for your customers and your consumers. Particularly the CPG industry, we sort of have two levels of relationships: the direct customers and then the consumers they serve. And we'll have some sort of data about them in many cases, and it's part of our business to protect that data. The Federal Trade Commission takes the position that to be in business without having adequate cybersecurity is an unfair method of competition. It's a violation of the Federal Trade Commission Act. And most notably, a few years ago, Wyndham Hotels got nailed for that because customer credit card data and other data was revealed, was disclosed to a hacker. Now, how did that happen? They had hired a company to do work on their HVAC system at one of their franchisees' hotels. So you understand that there's a couple levels of remoteness there. There's the corporate company, Wyndham. There are franchisees who the parent company doesn't own, but lets them use their name, and presumably they'll follow certain standards at the hotel. And then there's the third-party contractor who's doing work for the hotel. In order to do work for the hotel, apparently the hotel gave them access to their computer system, which was tied to the central Wyndham computer system where people made reservations and things like that. And the security breach was at the contractor level. So it's a salutary warning that security isn't just you, but it's also anyone else who has access to your data, to your system. Do you let them have access to everything? Do you wall them off? You let them have access at all? These are things that today we have to think about because the vulnerability goes to the weakest link in the chain. So here, just as a laundry list, are some of the things that you need to worry about in terms of cybersecurity. The phishing expeditions where people will come in and try to get information that they can use to do things with. Ransomware attacks where they let loose call it a virus on your system that spreads to all connected computers and locks them up, encrypts the information, and unless you pay a ransom, they won't unlock them. Concern about mobile devices and what information is on them. If you deal with the federal government, there's the National Institute of Security and of Standards and Technology that has a cybersecurity framework with very specific requirements for what you need to do to satisfy their requirements. And then I should say that if you're in the consulting business, a lot of the companies who are your clients may also have specific cybersecurity requirements that you may have encountered them already. If you haven't, you will, where they say, if you want to provide services to us, you have to agree to the following, which may also include an audit of your computer systems. And I say that from experience because my law firm has gone through that with several of our clients. And the first time we went through it, it was educational. I don't want to say it was painful, but it was educational. It was like learning that the version of Microsoft Windows that we had purchased for my newly formed law firm, even though it was designed for business, was not the version that supported encryption of hard drives. If we wanted to have that feature built into Windows, we'd have to buy still a different version. And no one had told us that in the beginning. So you learn things sometimes the hard way. In any event, cloud security is a big issue. Is your cloud provider doing adequate security. Using Wi-Fi, everyone is all excited about the ability to do work at Starbucks. Nobody should be, because that's very unsecure, and anyone with a very inexpensive little piece of software can be snooping on what you're doing in the store, and you get a warning saying this is unencrypted, this is an open network. Be very careful there. Concerned about email authentication, are you getting it from the person you think you're getting it from it? Is there physical security? Is the data that's kept in your office or in your home physically secure, not just electronically, but there are papers. We actually still use paper today, and that's something that has to be protected. Think about the security of removable media, backup devices. In some cases, you may want to set up a system that prevents employees from downloading data. We have in my office, even though I trust everyone implicitly in the law firm, if somebody were to download an excessive number of files from our system, I will get a warning. I got one the other day when a paralegal was downloading some documents, and I got a warning that said, Lakia has downloaded 2,000 documents from NetDocuments. And I looked at it and had a concern, but I couldn't really figure out what she was doing or why she'd be interested. And so I went over to her office and said, Leah, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm getting ready for trial. I'm downloading the exhibits. And so, okay, good. Actually, proper conduct, harmless activity, and I'm glad the system reminded me. There are all sorts of scams going out there, whether they come in by telephone or by email. People claim to be from Microsoft or tech support company. You have to be careful about the vendors with whom you deal, whether they're legitimate, whether they have adequate protection for the data you provide them. The concern about whether your identity has been stolen and could be used to scam somebody else, and then the blame comes back to you. You really have to make sure that you understand the basics of the structure of the internet and how things are interconnected. We'll talk a little bit later about the role of cyber insurance, which I encourage everyone in business to have. It's not without its issues. We'll get to that later. Who is your web host? What's their security? And then, since I'm a lawyer, I can't let go of the legal issues, so I'll talk a little bit about the legal types of exposure that come with all of this. So the first thing to do is understand what you have. You really should have an index or a directory of all the information that you keep. And you need to think about things like customer and client financial and account information. If you're working on any transactions, very often they're not public, and this would be of value to certain people, either so they can perhaps trade on it in advance of it being announced or threaten to blow it up by revealing it. Are there trade secrets or any other sorts of business know-how on your system, on your company's system, that would be valuable to a competitor? Is there any personally identifiable information, credit information, healthcare information? There are specific privacy rules in most states regarding data breaches, but recently California has enacted a very detailed privacy law that goes into effect next year and requires certain protections of data, things that can be kept, things that can't be kept, notification to people whose data you have. So do you have that stuff? Do you know what your obligations are? And if you do business internationally, we have the GDPR regulations from the European Union, which unfortunately aren't exactly the same as the California law. So you have to look at both of them to make sure you're in compliance. But the California law, I think, is important both for companies who do business in California or with California consumers, and as a harbinger of what might be coming for other states in the future. Activists are very interested in this subject, and they're going to be running to state legislatures all over to try and come up with other versions of that law. I think the chances of there being a federal statute in that area are still a ways off, but as I said before, the Federal Trade Commission already takes it as an unfair and deceptive method of competition if you don't have adequate protection of information. So I think you have to really consider that there is federal exposure for that kind of breach anyhow. The other thing to mention, as I suggested before on my paralegals issue, is there a possibility in your company of insider misuse? Is there any system in place to at least alert you from insiders doing unauthorized things with the data that they can obtain? I know when companies first started doing a lot of outsourcing to other countries where the costs were lower, this was a concern, and the response in many cases was to say, well, these people have devices where we have disabled the USB port so they can't plug a USB stick in there, or they can't pull the data off easily. Okay, that's one step, but the whole issue of, can someone who has access to the data misuse it and do something unauthorized with it? If in fact it's your own company, you certainly have an obligation to have training on policies and procedures regarding data and how they have to comply in order to be allowed to use computer systems, and there has to be enforcement of policies and procedures. So a policy about doing something that's never enforced, or the employees don't know that there is enforcement, that someone has been disciplined or fired for violating the policy, that policy is not going to have much impact. So the real obligation is to make sure that these things are enforced and employees know about it. So a quick survey of continuing legal developments, and it's a moving target, because just like the bad guys continually evolve the way they deal with it, the states continually evolve what the legal requirements are with regard to privacy and cybersecurity. So we have notification obligations from, I believe, all of the states now. If there's a security breach in a state, it will trigger certain obligations, and we'll talk about Illinois in a minute. Companies generally need to have compliance programs to deal with the issue of human gullibility, and we'll talk about this and the issue there, why that's a legal as well as a business issue, is that in cases of prosecution for certain legal violations, prosecutors will give credit for essentially how hard the company tried to prevent the violation. Part of that is the extent to which there was really a company effort to train employees on what to do and what not to do. The SEC has come up with rules on this subject. We'll talk about that for 1 second. And believe me, I'll keep the legal stuff short. The issue today is shareholder suits. If there's a public company, the shareholders will sue for damaging the value of the company. If you're in financial services, there are more specific rules for that area. We have an issue of people misusing data from social media sites. More and more devices make use of connections to the internet, sometimes referred to IoT, or the Internet of Things. Do you know what the security is on those devices that your company may be developing or using. And there's an expanding view of privacy rights, as I already mentioned. Here's what Illinois has. They call the Personal Information Protection Act. And so the first question is, does your firm handle non-public personal information? And this is the definition that Illinois uses. And I put it in there because there are 50 different definitions. So each state where you might possess personal information, you have to check what they think it is. Is it just a username or an email address? Or does it have to have some other thing combined with it, an address, a social security number, etc.? But in any event, if you in Illinois and any contractor you use handles any of this information, you have to implement reasonable security measures to protect data from access, acquisition, etc. So the obligation here is on protecting that information. And if there is a data breach, you have to notify Illinois residents without unreasonable delay. Give them a toll-free number to call, websites of consumer reporting agencies, and then explain how they can get a fraud alert and a security freeze from one of the agencies. If you're dealing with healthcare information, you don't really have to comply with that act, but if you have other HIPAA requirements, but you must tell the Attorney General. And consumers have a direct right to sue the company under the Illinois Consumer Fraud and Deceptive Business Practices Act, and the Illinois Attorney General may decide to bring in action too for the negligence of the company, so the consequences will become even more significant. Just an example of another state's reaction and how a breach might occur. So Pennsylvania sued Uber because of the loss of information regarding 57 million passengers and drivers. How did the hackers get access? Well, Uber had used GitHub, which is a third-party site where developers of apps share code. And so the idea is, you can share certain things with other developers, and they'll give you ideas, and you can learn from them. But as part of that, they gave access, or the apps they were developing gave access to Uber's actual live site of the people ordering their cars. And Uber paid the ransom. So they paid these people to be quiet and not do anything. And sort of the joke is, these hackers were honorable. They took the ransom. They said, okay, fine, we'll do what we tell you. And if it's any consolation, most of the hackers are honorable, and I say that with air quotes if I can, because they'll accept their ransom with the idea of, if the reputation is such that they'll take the ransom and not release the data, no one will ever pay the ransom. So we'll talk about that coming back in a few minutes. But so Uber paid the ransom, and the state sued them. They said, wait a second, there was a statute that said you're supposed to notify everyone within a reasonable time, and a year was not a reasonable time. And this violated the Pennsylvania state law. And we, by the way, have a rule, and so the 13,500 drivers each generates $1,000 of fine, so that you owe us $13.5 million. And by the way, AWS, Amazon Web Services, was the host of GitHub. So that's the cloud host of the service. And AWS is used by many other companies for hosting, and they were not responsible for this. They did not do anything wrong, according to this lawsuit. Their security wasn't breached. It was the people on the site, which is open to lots of people, who put information there that enabled the bad guys to get into Uber. So you have to understand that the internet is a two-edged sword. It has great power to enable the sharing of information and really do great things with cloud sourcing and the sharing things in the commons. But then that's a threat too, because when you're sharing information, you're sharing with good guys as well as bad guys. So anything you put out there in the open, you have to be really certain is not going to be used by bad guys for bad things. But here's the biggest risk. The biggest risk is the user. And sometimes it's been abbreviated as PEBCAC. The problem exists between the chair and the keyboard. So it's that person in the middle who is making decisions, and very often those decisions are very risky. So here's some examples of things that I've collected, just that come into me. I stopped collecting them really because I stopped getting them, but phishing attempts come in that look really, really legitimate. And as you can see, some of the logos they use look really good, and they go through all sorts of things on the screen. You know, notice and disclosure, fifth third, etc. Release undelivered messages. Hey, you have undelivered messages. Wouldn't it be reasonable just to click to get those released? Sometimes for law firms, we always get emails from people in far-off countries looking for a lawyer. And, you know, we have an important matter we need you to handle. Click here and we'll tell you more information. And we know that as tempting as that is for a small firm to want to get business, that's not how people do it. So that's another example of a phishing email. So the question is, do employees know how to deal with phishing attempts? Do you know how to recognize attempts such as these? Now, in many cases, you can look at the email address and see that the name doesn't really match the internet address of the title, and that's a clue, or it just could be something that looks funny, smells funny. Very often it'll be an email from somebody you may actually know, but it's an old email address. Particularly AOL seems to have a really weak security system. So if you get an email that's from a friend, it says, hey, this is from Perry Scholes at AOL. Take a look at this website. You'll really like it, Ted. Now, normally I would get an email from Perry and that would be fine, but I say, wait a second. He hasn't been on AOL for 15 years. First warning sign. Second of all, he would never send an email like that. Take a look at this website. So that is a common way that people do it to get you to click on something that might release a virus or try to get into your own computer. But here, by the way, is one of the most popular phishing subjects that's out there at this moment. The bad guys in many countries have started sending around emails about here's what you need to know before you travel on a Boeing 737 MAX 8, or here's why you're at risk from this plane. In other words, something that a lot of people are interested in, and say, oh, gee, I should click on that. So if you get an email that at all is funny, either from the language or from an unrecognized sender, or from a sender whose name you think you recognize, number one, don't click on it, and number two, check with the sender. If it's someone you know, did you send me this? Then they would say, no, I didn't, and I'm sorry. So I would say to them, please change the password on your AOL account. One of the popular frauds is a scammer that sends an email purporting to come from the CEO or some other senior executives demanding an immediate response and it usually involves sending money somewhere. And this happened to my firm, and we're still not sure how it happened, but one of my partners was out of town, and the person who is an accounting clerk got an email from her, or purporting to come from her, saying, Pat, could you please wire transfer $10,000 to this account, and it's for our new client. And she had a bank account number, and the bank was legitimate. It looked like it was okay. And fortunately, the clerk came to me and said, do you know who this client is? You know what this is about? How the scammers knew that my partner was out of town, and how they knew that Pat was an accounting clerk who paid bills, still is a mystery. So that's one of the reasons I suggest, in terms of using social media, don't reveal your life. Don't give people information that they might use. So my partner might have revealed on Facebook or Instagram or something, hey, I'm in New York today, just saw the Statue of Liberty. And so someone would know, okay, she's a partner of this firm, she's not in the office. Or Pat may have revealed on LinkedIn, my job responsibilities in the law firm of Sharp Bank Smarmer includes handling accounts payable. Now, I'm not to say that you shouldn't reveal everything, and certainly LinkedIn is a valuable site, and my experience and activities are up there, but always maintain a degree of skepticism about requests you get by email from people you can't talk to, at least not easily, that require immediate action. Very often they are suspicious. Dealing with this in a firm is training of everybody. We used to have a series of lunchtime meetings where people would bring in the latest scam letter, and you saw some of those before, and people got wise pretty quickly. And then you can also use email scanning to reduce the risk, and I'll talk about that in a second. In the employee training, you should always make sure they understand the password rules. Never reuse a password, because sometimes there will be a data breach that you won't know about. So the data breach would have been 3 years ago, and the people who captured the data from your system are just sitting there. And then at some point they'll sell it. Let's say they got the password list. They'll sell it to some other bad guy on the assumption that even though it's 3 years old, most of this data is still pretty good. So you may have changed your password and then moved it back to an old one, or not changed it, and bingo, then that stuff is all valuable. I encourage everyone to use two-factor passwords. So you log into the system with one password, and then it says, okay, we're going to send a numerical code to a cell phone or to a different email address, and then you can't get into the system until you put that code in. Yes, it's a pain, but it really goes a long way towards limiting the ability of a hacker to get in, even if they got your password. Don't use an email address as an ID to log on to something. It's very tempting, but use something else because you want to make it difficult. So use some sort of version of your name that's not obvious as your ID, and then a complex series of letters, numbers, and characters to be the password. Every employee has to know about the importance of protecting data, and simple rules like don't open attachments ever if you don't recognize the sender. Think about what it means if you get a pop-up message from somebody, or it appears that you're on a malicious site, and be very careful of what you put on social media, because that might give people the ability to misuse that information. Companies that allow people to bring their own devices to work, and even if you provide devices to employees, have to make sure that they update the software frequently, because software updates generally include security improvements. There should be an antivirus, anti-malware program on there. The devices should be encrypted. Sometimes there's an additional security pin that's put into the device. There should be a lost phone policy. What happens when the phone is lost or stolen? Passwords must be mandatory instead of being able to use the device without a password. If you have a phone, you should have remote wiping. And if you're going to allow employees to access the network, the internal network remotely, there should be a virtual private network that they have to go through to get there, so that yes, you can use it from Starbucks, but you don't log into the regular network. You log into the office, you have to use an encrypted network that requires additional passwords, and someone who is looking over your shoulder won't be able to get into that. And I'd also say that if you use your smartphone as a hotspot, that's fairly secure. I mean, a lot of people don't want to do that because they're burning up data units on their phone plan. Do that. I mean, that is what I do. Coming to work on the train in the morning, I use my cell phone as a hotspot, even though the train car might have an open internet connection. If I'm just looking at email and things like that, it doesn't really use that many data units, so it's not a big deal. I'm not going to watch a movie that way, but it's secure. And you should always, if it's a company, they have the obligation to enable their employees to do what you want them to do. So they have to provide a way to do it. So just thinking about the lost laptop, you have to ask the questions if a laptop is lost. Was there something there that wasn't supposed to be there? Was there actual data on the laptop that is sensitive? Was the information encrypted on the laptop? So if some bad guy gets it, are they going to be able to make use of the information, or they just have a laptop that they could peddle on the market? And the thing to think about for companies is whether there's any teeth in a rule. Will the employee suffer consequences? Now, I know that there'll be debate about whether the employee should suffer the consequences. I mean, if the laptop was locked in your trunk and someone broke into your car and stole it out of the trunk, is that negligent? Some people would say it is. I don't know, but companies are starting to charge employees who lose company devices if not the whole thing, at least a percentage of the value of it. And if there's a cost to recover data, or if something bad happens, they're pushing that down to the employee. The purpose is you want employees to think twice before they're careless with their laptop. And the same thing with cell phones. We want people to have access to networks, and that means that there is valuable data on the phone or access to data. So you have to ask your question, okay, is it going to be a company-provided device, or is it a personal device? If there's data that is on the phone, is it backed up? Is the phone encrypted? Does it have something like a remote wipe capability so that if someone reports a lost phone, you can push a button and zap, there's nothing left on it. If you're dealing with a public company, the SEC has said that this is a very important area, and that public companies have an obligation to inform investors about cybersecurity risks, and this is part of the company's obligation to maintain comprehensive policies and procedures. In addition to damaging the business, there's also the issue of facilitating insider trading if they have a very porous system on company information. Every company, every individual using the internet should have an adequate suite of technology that's in there. And so you should start with antivirus, anti-malware, et cetera, software on your device, on every device, a phone, a laptop, a pad, etc. If you're in a company, there should also be a hardware firewall that is in between you and the internet that controls what goes out there. Cloud storage tends to be safer than having a server in your office or in your home that can be penetrated by someone else. I still believe that Amazon, Microsoft, and some of the other big providers do a very good job on security that really limits, if not completely prevents, the ability of an outsider to get into that system. So the state of the art today is that doing business on the cloud is really fairly secure in terms of what is at rest in the cloud. Also recommend using a cloud backup system, and the fuzzy image on the screen is from Avamar, which is a product that I know about because my firm uses it. And the theory there is we keep the vast bulk of our data in the cloud, but on a given day, we'll be doing work at a workstation, at a computer on someone's desk, and that work will sit on the computer until we decide that, okay, it's ready to be saved more or less in the official folder where this stuff sits. But for that day, at least, and maybe longer, the stuff is on the computer. So each day we have this tool called Avamar run on every device in the office, and it backs it up to a separate site on the cloud. The theory here is that if we are hit by a ransomware attack, someone will come in and say, aha, we gotcha. And if you want your data on all of your devices to be accessible, you have to pay us the ransom. Our response, I'm pretty sure our response will be, screw you, and we would then go to all the computers, take out the hard drives, and throw them away. Because at worst, we would be out 1 day's worth of data, because everything else would be backed up in the cloud or stored on the cloud officially. So this is both in terms of a device failure. You know, in the old days, we did backups because we were worried about things crashing. But here we think that this is both a protection against a device failure and protection against a ransomware attack. It's preferable to having an attached backup device, and I'm sure you've all seen them, because what we've been told is that if you're hit by a ransomware attack, that software will look for all hardware devices attached to your computer, so it would also infect the attached backup drive. So while those drives may be very helpful in terms of preventing, providing a cushion if there's a device failure, they're not going to stop the hacker. So this is one piece of technology that can be used to help frustrate attempts to attack your system. As many of you may know, our friends at Mondelez were hit with this kind of attack a couple of years ago, and it did a lot of damage to the company until they were able to recover. And we'll come back to that in a second. But here's another thing you can do. Another software service does real-time scanning of inbound email and website requests. So here's a copy of one of the routine messages I get 3 times a day from a system called the Mimecast. And so here you can see, well, they basically said, we received this message, we're looking at it, we don't know what to do with it, you tell us. Now, what this system will do is it'll intercept known bad things based on an examination of the sender and any attachments, or it will intercept things that looks like are just spam. A lot of junk mail comes in. Do I want to allow this? So I look at this, said, oh, it's from Law Bulletin Media. They're the people that publish Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Yeah, it's probably advertising, but I know those guys, and that's okay. So then over at the far right, I have my choice. I can release it, which is just, well, I'm not sure about the sender, but I'll release this one email to take a look at it. Or you could block it permanently, not interested in ever hearing from this sender again. Or I could permit it and say, okay, I'm fine with this, and they can send it to me. But what has happened is Mimecast literally intercepts everything that comes to us before we see it, and it's not a noticeable delay, almost instantaneous. Compares it against their database, does a real-time scan of the message and the contents, and delivers a message like this. If it's an obvious bad guy, we just never see it. It just never gets to us. So we only see this when there are questions. We might get a message like that from a sender. This link that you've been asked to click on downloads a file. Do you want to do it? Now in this case, the file was okay, it was checked, and so I have the choice of downloading it or not. People who are directors or officers or corporations themselves have the obligation to really ensure that their companies have adequate cybersecurity. And in one case, this is actually from the UK, the court there said, look, whatever the technology is, whatever the training is, you have an obligation in the company to insure yourself against such catastrophes. And it's been available. You didn't do it. You're failing in your duty as an officer or director of the company. So let's talk about insurance for a second. The old school CGL policies that companies have generally exclude coverage for cyber incidents. Okay, fine. So let's have specialized coverage. So then a couple years ago, when Mondelez was hit by a ransomware attack, in this case it was the NotPetya virus, it really damaged them. It started in Eastern Europe, and it may have started in the Ukraine and then spread throughout Europe, across the ocean, and then brought the company down. Allegedly, this virus came from Russia, and it was developed and deployed originally as Russia was fighting with Ukraine. And it was a way that they were trying to attack the Ukraine by bringing down their government computers and their business computers. And Mondelez has operations in the Ukraine, and probably that's where it picked it up. But as it started out, it was unknowingly transmitted throughout the company, and by the time the message got out, don't turn on your computer, don't turn on your computer, it was sort of too late. So Mondelez went back and forth with its insurer, Zurich American, and eventually Zurich said, we're not going to cover it because this policy has war exclusion language. It didn't say it wouldn't cover cyber events, but it said it won't cover acts of war. And this virus originated as a Russian military attack against Ukraine. So the lawsuit was filed in Cook County Circuit Court late last year. It's still pending. It will be interesting to see what happens. You don't want your insurance coverage to be easily thwarted just by saying, oh, that's a bad thing. It happened because of a war action. That would negate everything. So number one, you need a specialized cybersecurity policy. And then number two, you or someone on your behalf needs to read it so you understand all of the exclusions. And even though I'm supposed to know something about this subject, when I read my firm's cybersecurity policy, it gives me a headache because there are so many twists and turns. And I guess the best I could say is I think we're covered, but this is a developing area, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But the bottom line advice is get an insurance policy. Even if you're just a one-person consulting company, make sure that you're covered and you won't pay the price for it. Your carrier is going to ask certain questions. What kind of data, what kind of security systems, and if they ask you questions, you have to make sure they're accurate, because if in fact, for example, they ask you if you use encryption and you say yes, and it turns out that the device that was hacked wasn't encrypted, they're going to deny coverage. And understand that you may want both first-party coverage, which means how was I hurt by the attack, and third-party coverage, which is okay. How am I going to deal with claims from my customers about this? And once again, read it carefully. Make sure that you understand what you're getting for the money when you do get one of these policies. Just sort of interesting here. Yahoo was hit with a data breach, and there were a lot of problems here, and it was interesting that the lawsuits that came from private parties really went more to violation of securities law. They figured we've got something here that we can make more money out of, rather than trying to prove each person's damages, as you might think in a traditional lawsuit. So if it's a public company, understand that the exposure is a securities lawsuit based on violation of those laws. And understand, of course, that things on social media, as they are ubiquitous, really have a problem. And Zuckerberg is facing billions of dollars in damages for Facebook because of what they did, which is basically nothing. They didn't really understand who was advertising. They didn't understand how the data was used, how data was leaked, so they would have personal data about users, and other companies would get that data, and users wouldn't know, and it's just a mess. So be careful what you put on social media, and if you use social media for your business, be very discreet about it. And I would recommend not having consumer data on a Facebook site at all. As hardware advances, we have more opportunities to have our lives made simpler. My wife uses our little Alexa device instead of a shopping list. I mean, she's sitting in the kitchen. He says, "Alexa, add peanut butter to the shopping list." And then when she goes to the store, she brings it up on her phone, and there's her shopping list. And it's terrific. However, there's so many things in there that are problematic. We understand that Alexa, people at Amazon are actually listening to Alexa all the time, just so they can learn more about how people talk. And so if you have one of those, at a minimum, mute it so that it can't record your voice. Question of what data is stored on these devices. Are they subject to a search warrant? How long are they? How long is the data stored? So all these hardware devices that enable voice communication are going to raise new cybersecurity issues. If you are hurt by a cybersecurity breach, can you sue? There's one Supreme Court case which says, well, you can sue if you have an invasion of a legally protected interest that is concrete and particularized and actual, non-conjectural, or hypothetical. Now, what does that mean? The courts do not know. There's different results in different courts all across the country. And the question is, if there was a breach but no evidence yet that anything was done with your data, can you be sued? Can you sue? And in some states, yes, just based on the fear of future harm of what they're going to do with that data. And in other states, no, that doesn't meet the Spokio test. So stand by. There's going to be more legal developments in this area. So in summary, basically saying, how do you get ready? You might want to go to the FTC site and read this publication called Start with Security. You should understand where your data comes and goes. If you have a company and you're not sure what to do, should you hire a consultant? Probably yes. Think about the security of your remote services, like can the third-party HVAC contractor get into your system? And if so, why? Is it adequate security? Are people being trained? Are they doing stupid things? Is your password rule substantial enough to provide security? Do you use a VPN to get access? Is your website secure? There should be encryption for any sort of storage of information. You should have a backup system and a response plan. What will happen if we're hit? What will happen if there's an attack? How will we respond? You should have a comprehensive records management policy for your business. Get insurance and do ongoing monitoring and auditing to make sure all this stuff works. So with all of that, I would wish you good luck. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the chat box to see if anyone has a question. I see one from Perry. Is Norton antivirus software an option? Yes, it's necessary. It's not sufficient by itself. So that should be one of the things on a computing device, but that wouldn't necessarily stop someone from clicking on a website that's engaging in phishing or is trying to fool you into opening an attachment or clicking on a link. So if no one else has any other questions, all right. So the question is, what is cyber insurance called? It's just called cyber insurance, and any insurance broker will be able to tell you, and I recommend getting multiple quotes. It is available to consultants, absolutely available for any size business. I'm not sure about individuals, but it'd be worth checking, and it may be that some homeowners policies may actually have a cyber insurance endorsement, but certainly is a good thing to do. Not terribly expensive, and it should be something that's affordable to anyone who has a business. Okay, yeah, and Perry is commenting that he has a MiFi device, so I don't use free Wi-Fi. Absolutely right. That is the way to do it. May cost a little bit, but it's definitely that in itself is a form of insurance and is the right way to go if you're on the road at all. I think about your home. If you're doing work from home, make sure your own internet connection is secure and you've got a robust password and people can't snoop by driving down your street, or maybe have a snoopy neighbor. Anyhow. And I think that brings us to the end. Perry, any other comments?
No, thank you. This was amazing. I've got half a page full of notes for all the things I'm exposed. So thank you very much for sharing a wealth of knowledge, and we will hopefully have you back for another session of equal relevant and important data.
Okay, well, happy to come back, and thanks everyone who was listening.